Welcome to ACS Webinars, connecting you with the best and brightest minds in chemistry, live every Thursday from Washington, D.C. I'm Michael David, and I will be your host for today's broadcast, which is being co-produced with ACS Professional Education. Being fluent in Spanish doesn't do much good when you're in Italy, and being an expert in chemistry might not help you get your message across if your audience doesn't know what a covalent bond is. Today, we will be joined by our own Chris McCarthy, who works with social media and member engagement here at the American Chemical Society. Chris is going to share some tips on how to assess your audience and modify your message to have the most impact. Our moderator for today is Brian Tweedy, who is a senior manager with ACS Learning and Career Development and Professional Resources, where he manages our professional education trainings, career services, and leadership development programs. So Brian, with that, I will turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Mike. No matter what your career, you will likely be called upon to provide a presentation to an audience. This may be an audience of your peers or the public at large. In either case, you will want the audience to be able to digest and comprehend what you are presenting. ACS understands this and has developed a suite of workshops to prepare you for delivering your content to various audiences. Our speaker today is Chris McCarthy. Chris is manager for social media and member engagement at the American Chemical Society. He has been with ACS for more than 12 years in various communications and digital content roles. Prior to working at ACS, Chris managed public relations for flavor and fragrance industry trade associations and for Interdisciplinary Computing Research Institute at the University of Maryland. He also attended the University of Maryland for both an undergraduate degree in English and a Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. That's the question I want to start off with. Why would you want to be better at communicating your science? I think it's really important for career advancement that you might interact with your non-technical colleagues, or you might be applying for funding, and you have to explain to non-scientists why your research is important. When it comes to education or outreach, if you're doing events with future chemists, possibly, or if you just want to increase scientific literacy among the public at large, that's really important. With policy and law, being able to speak clearly about science and what the science is saying to influence policy is really important as we move forward in the world today. And then just for social reasons, being able to explain what you're doing on a daily basis to your family, or if you meet someone at a party who asks what you do for a living or what you're studying. Hopefully, we can go over some things about how you could be better at communicating your science. And one of the things that we talk about at ACS is about speaking simply. And we have some tips here. We're going to focus on knowing your audience, but that's the first step, is figuring out who you're trying to reach and what is important to them. And then you want to distill the message. You may be able to speak to your fellow scientists with a lot of technical terms that will completely go over the heads of a general audience or those without the training that you've had. You want to focus on why. When you are often explaining research, you talk about how you got to the methods that you used and not as much on the outcome. When you're talking to the public, you really want to focus more on the outcome, why it matters to them. You want to use storytelling. You want to be able to invite people in. You want to engage them in a way that makes them feel like they care about what you're talking about. And then finally, you want to practice. You need to practice, practice, practice. That is, like most skills, being able to communicate better is all about feeling more comfortable, learning from different interactions that you have, and being able to move forward. So I'm going to start off with a quote from Anthony Lazarowitz, who's the director of the Yale program on climate change communication, who said that not knowing your audience is like throwing darts at a dartboard with the lights off. And that's really true. You need to be able to understand your audience, what they care about. Otherwise, you may connect with them, you may not. But in order to really be able to ensure that you're appealing to them in a way that makes them feel like they care about what you're talking about, they understand what you're talking about, and if you want them to take some sort of action, that they know what that is, you need to understand your audience. You may have heard of the rhetorical triangle if you have ever had a freshman composition class, but really it comes down to this relationship between you, the speaker, the message that you're talking about, and the audience. And good communication is dependent on all three of those. So it's your job to connect with the audience. If you have ever heard someone say, well, I spoke and I don't think the audience got it, usually what that means is I didn't figure out how to reach that audience. So also knowing your audience will inform the language that you use, the analogies that you employ, and the goals of your interactions. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, who are they? Are they other researchers? Are they policymakers? Your neighbors? Are these children and parents at an outreach event? I try to encourage people not to default to saying, well, I want to communicate with the general public. That's a very broad category. You want to try and be as specific as possible when you're thinking about who you're interacting with, considering where the interaction will happen, whether it's the format, whether it's you're speaking to them or you're writing something that they'll be reading. You want to have someone in mind. A lot of times there are marketers will talk about personas, or I work primarily in social media, and I've spoken to some of my counterparts at AARP, the American Association for Retired People. Actually, when they are writing social media content, they have a very specific person in mind. They have this imaginary person that they're writing to, and I believe her name was Doris, and she lives in the Southwest. They have a whole bio that they're thinking of because they want to think about the person who is receiving this message, and they think about, what was this going to resonate with her? What does she care about? So I think that's important, and it will help you when you're working on crafting your message to imagine the people who will be receiving it. You also want to think about cultural differences that you need to be aware of. You want to consider the demographics of your group. So you have to do your homework. Sometimes it's about asking the organizer who you are working with, who are the types of people who've been to events like this? What do they care about? You also want to think about this in terms of the presentation that you're working on. If you have slides accompanying it, or if you are using examples, that you're using examples that relate to the people that you're speaking to. So if you were, for instance, working on an outreach event for a Girl Scout troop, and you had a presentation where there are only men scientists who are in your slides, then you're really not necessarily connecting with those people. You're not thinking about what matters to them or how they could relate to that, to what you're trying to say. So you also want to think about this in terms of what is their frame of reference. So if you are, again, say, speaking to a group of fifth graders or younger people, and you're talking about a scientific process, and you use an analogy like it's like filing your taxes. Well, fifth graders don't often have to file income tax, so they don't really understand what that means. If you said something like, it's like doing your homework, that's in their universe, so it helps them relate to it more. You also want to ask yourself, what do they know already? And it's important not to think of science communication as dumbing down. You have to have respect for your audience, even if they have different knowledge from you. You need to find the balance between over-explaining in a way that makes your audience feel that you don't respect them or that you're talking down to them, or assuming too much technical knowledge and having your talk go way over their head. And these things can often change. So I like to think about something like DNA. 50 years ago, not many people would know that, but now, thanks to things like Law and Order or CSI or the personal DNA testing like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, a lot more people know that. In fact, people will even say something is in their DNA. So it's become mainstream. So it's really important to think about what they know and how you can find that balance between not speaking over their heads and not talking down to them. We're ready for a question now.
First question for all of you is, how much does the average American know about science? So this is according to a Pew Research Center study published in March 2019. What percentage of Americans were classified as having high science knowledge, which is that they answered 80% or more questions correctly on a general science quiz? Was that 1 in 10 people, 3 in 10, 4 in 10, 5 in 10, or 6 in 10? All right, Chris, about 51% of the audience said 1 in 10, 33 said 3 in 10, 9% said 4 in 10, and it just kind of goes down from there. So do you know the correct answer?
Sure. The correct answer is actually, it's very promising, is about 4 in 10 Americans were able to get between 9 and 11 correct answers on an 11-item scale. So that was classified as having high science knowledge. And roughly 1/3 were in the medium, and then about 3 in 10, again, were in the low science group. This is, of course, not a huge index of the in-depth science knowledge that the average American has, but it is a good indicator that the average American knows a bit more about science than maybe you think. And questions related to health and medicine were more frequently known by Americans. So I think some of the questions were related to things like the incubation period, what does that mean? Or what is the antibiotic resistant medication? What's the concern there? Actually, the question that was most frequently missed was probably chemistry related, which was an antacid relieves an overly acidic stomach because the main components of antacids are blank, and most Americans did not know the correct answer was bases. And this is some more information. There's a link to that Pew Research Center study. Pew Research also has some great studies about what Americans think about scientists. And the good news is that Americans like scientists. So you're coming into and interacting with the public with some credibility. So the next thing you want to ask yourself is, what do they want to know? The last thing you want your audience to think is, so what? You need to find the connection between what matters to them and what matters to you. So you may be very keen on like 5 or 6 things about your research, the possibilities for how it could improve people's lives, or the ways that it could reduce the environmental impact, or if you're working on materials that will make our technology better. You need to find out what's going to resonate with them. And I think if you're, one way to think about this is if you're going to, Capitol Hill or your state house, or you're talking to someone who's a policymaker, say you're working on research that maybe has a health impact that could improve people's health, or that there's a financial impact that it could save businesses money. Some senators or congresspeople will care about the financial matters more than they will the health matters. Others will care about the health matters more than the financial matters. So it's really figuring out what matters to the audience and tailoring your message to them. If you want them to care about what you have to say, you have to show them. And what do you want them to remember? You should have a takeaway message in mind, the one thing that you want them to remember when they're done the interaction. So sometimes you're speaking to inform or educate, and other times you're communicating with people to take an action. Marketers will call this a call to action, or lobbyists will call it an ask, but you want to make it clear. You want to have people come away saying, I understand this is something that I should do. If you want your boss to move in a different direction on a research project, or you want your elected official to vote a certain way, you want people to change their behaviors to be more sustainable and lessen the environmental impact of what they're doing. You need to make that clear. They should be able to walk away knowing what you think will make the world a better place. So I have some examples about communicating about one topic with different audiences that show how you want to tailor your message to the audience. So these are some things that ACS has put out related to climate change. This is a press release that is something that goes to people in the news media to encourage them to write a news story or cover it on a radio show. And reporters are interested in news, so they're looking to cover events as they happen. They really want to focus on research when it's published, or when it's being presented, or when a product is launched. They really want to have something being new. So if you look at the beginning of this press release, it points out that the information being shared is in light of the recent release. So it's talking about, this is a current event that's happening, and here's more information about ACS and our policies related to climate change. Similarly, this is a policy statement, which is something that can help people who are working with communicating with lawmakers. You'll notice that there's a summary on the right that has the position in brief. Again, lawmakers are usually very busy. They don't have a lot of time. They meet with a lot of constituents. So you need to go in with that clear, this is what my ask is, and you want to have that highlighted. So a document like this can help you to have that in mind when you're communicating with that kind of an audience. This is one of the ACS reactions videos that talks about emissions from cows and how they contribute to climate change. So this video is a little more fun, tongue-in-cheek. It's using animation and eye-catching visuals to tell its story, because videos, they tend to be something that is short and you want to get to the point. Usually people on YouTube aren't going to be watching an hour-long show. They want to watch something in a few minutes. So you want to be able to catch their attention, and you're not necessarily going to be able to get as much information, but you're trying to connect with them where they are and highlight what's important. And this is from our Celebrating Chemistry publication, I think this was from Chemists Celebrate Earth Week. And this is an article that's written for children. It's a little maybe more educational than some things that would be shared with the younger audience, but you really want to, again, it's something that is written at their level that highlights some things for them and has interesting visuals that appeal to a younger audience. You probably wouldn't see this in something these kind of visuals in something like Time or Newsweek, but this is something that's written like for a younger later elementary school audience. So now we have another question. I'll turn it over to Mike.
Our next question for all of you is, how does the public feel about science? Now, according to the 2018 research from Science Counts, what feelings about science are most frequently expressed by members of the public? Would it be joy and excitement, boredom and indifference, caution, hope, or disbelief? All right, Chris, we kind of had a tie between caution and hope with 33 and 32%. Next highest was joy and excitement. 12% said bored and indifferent, and only 5% said disbelief. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
The audience was pretty close. The most frequent feeling described about science from the public was hope. And that was more than 60% of the members said that they felt hope when thinking about some of the things they were hearing about science. And this is interesting because, and this is research from Science Counts and the Alan Alda Center on Communicating Science. One of the interesting things that Science Counts pointed out when they were talking about this research is that for most scientists, because they also did a survey of scientists, both members of scientific societies like the American Chemical Society and also researchers at universities in the United States, that for most of the science, that joy and excitement was the most frequent emotion that they shared relating to science, with hope being a close second. And what Science Counts pointed out that was interesting is that if you think about hope as a feeling or something that how science makes them feel, then that is very focused on outcome. Whereas joy and excitement is much more of a present emotion. It is not forward-looking. It's in this moment, I'm excited about this. And it's not surprising that scientists who maybe are focused more on the process, the day-to-day, I'm working on this science. And I like the finding this out in the lab. I like the discovery. There's that current emotion that's happening. So I think that it's interesting that you can think about wanting to tap into that hope. And that, I think, kind of dovetails nicely with that third step, which is focusing on why. Because really, for a lot of people who are not scientists, they think of how science impacts them, and they think about outcomes. For a lot of scientists, they think about the process, the methods, and how they're working on that. How did they figure that out, and not why? Why is really important. So I talked about how knowing your audience really helps you, is the foundation for this. You need to understand your audience before you can really do a lot of these other steps. If you want to distill your message and take out the jargon and specialized language that disconnects your audience from you and from your message, you need to understand what they know and what they don't know. You need to have a little bit more of an understanding. So you might be speaking to other scientists in your discipline who have that knowledge, and you don't need to explain what an NMR is because they know. But if you're speaking to a lay audience or students in elementary school or high school, they may not know that, and you would have to explain. And you could even just say, well, this is a tool that I use and what it does, and not focus on the name. But again, focusing on why, really, how does it relate to the lives of the people in the audience? What ways can you connect it to what matters to them, what's personal to them, how they can come away from something feeling connected to it. You also want to tell stories, and understanding your audience is a great way to help you to figure out what stories are going to resonate with them, what analogies are going to work. If you're telling a story about your research, is it a mystery? Is it a love story? Is it a thriller? What personal things, anecdotes can you bring? Like, we went into this thinking it was going to be this way, and we discovered something completely different, and it changed the entire direction. It's a bit more interesting. Or sometimes if I was doing this research on new materials, there's a person who she was working on materials that could help soldiers who are being deployed do things more effectively. And her personal connection to that was about her brother who was in the military. So that made this connection that helped her connect with her audience because they saw her as a person who came to this with more than just, these are the facts, there's a connection. And then that practice, knowing your audience is so critical to practicing because in order to be really effective, you can practice on someone who is like the people in the audience that you are trying to reach. So maybe there is a non-technical person in your lab and you want to make sure that you're not oversimplifying or over-explaining a concept and you want to interact with a non-technical person. Maybe there's someone who works at the university or in your company who you could say, hey, could I borrow you for 15 minutes to talk to you about this and you give me some feedback? Practicing with people like the groups that you're trying to reach will help you to see your blind spots where you can improve your communication and make sure that you connect with the audience that you are trying to connect with. Another thing I would say that's great advice for people who are interested in being a better science communicator is to be part of an audience of those who receive science communication. There's a hashtag SciComm that you can follow on social media to see what others are doing, to find and network with peers. I'd say subscribe to science podcasts or video series. I put up a few that ACS puts out. There's the ACS reactions I mentioned before, ACS orbitals. There's also CNN Speaking of Chemistry and Stereochemistry. But there are dozens of interesting science video series or podcasts. I think one of the first podcasts I ever listened to was Radiolab, which has often has very interesting science stories that really connect you with research that people are doing. ACS also has some online resources. If you want to discover ways to communicate better, you can go to acs.org/communicate. If you want to learn more about how you can advocate for science with policymakers and lawmakers, ACS has an Act for Chemistry. There's a toolkit that can help you become better at that. There are also resources for helping to promote chemistry in your community through outreach, so acs.org/outreach. Last thing I'll say is there's a great opportunity to practice your science communication skills coming up in just a few months, this October during National Chemistry Week. This year's theme is Marvelous Metals. So digital material and resources are being launched today. You can check out the National Chemistry Week website at acs.org/NCW for tips on how to plan an outreach event and instructions on getting in touch with your local section outreach coordinator so you can volunteer at one of the many ACS-sponsored events. Thank you so much. This has been great, and I look forward to getting some of your questions.
So, Chris, first question we have here from Laura. She asks, are there specific issues for women communicating the science that men don't usually have to deal with?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say it really does depend on the audience. There might be some audiences that are more resistant, maybe just that haven't had as much experience with women communicating about science. But I definitely think that that is something that you want to consider. And you probably, I think the best thing that you could do is to talk to other women and hear about their experiences. I think there's such a robust community of science communicators online that can talk about that. And I think there are definitely some instances with, especially things on social media, that there have been times where, unfortunately, women can tend to be the victims of online harassment in a different way than men. And I think that's an issue that you should be aware of. I hope it doesn't cause a lot of fear. I think it's important to be aware of it, but there are ways that you can deal with it using some of the tools if you want to be more active online, but it is something that you should be aware of and have on your radar.
Great. Here's a question I think for you and I who work at ACS near and dear to our hearts. Marissa asks, in a company where acronyms are frequently used and encouraged, from department names to even test methods, how do you incorporate or leave out acronyms when speaking to a diverse audience?
That is a great question, and Brian is right. As people who work at ACS, I think that it took me at least a year to 16 months before I honestly understood a lot, like all the divisions and committees, and there are a lot of acronyms that we have at ACS. You know, acronyms serve a purpose, that kind of shortcut, the same as jargon. It is very easy when you're speaking within a kind of closed set of people that you use shortcuts rather than say the entire name. I would say that if you are talking to a wide audience, that if it is not a commonly understood acronym like DNA, that you should just remove it as much as possible, and that you think about what is it you're really trying to say. You can talk about a tool like an NMR, or you can talk about mass spec or things that you want to explain too much maybe to your audience. What really matters is what you are finding and what you're going to do with what you find, not necessarily how you found it.
Great. Here's a question from Anastasia. Do you have any practical tips on how to keep that balance between oversimplifying and getting too technical in your communication?
As somebody who has certain knowledge, you don't always know what other people know and don't know. So that practice, finding someone who is similar to who you're trying to reach and just running it by them. The other thing I think that is critical, and it depends on the format, but if you're talking an in-person engagement, is being aware always and reading the audience. So you want to, as you're talking, look for people who are nodding or understanding. And if you see puzzled looks, maybe you want to slow down and you might want to explain something, or you might even want to ask as part of the talk, do you know what this is? And then if they, if people don't, you can explain it a little bit more, or you can find a way to talk about it that is indirect, that again doesn't get bogged down in the details of the process, but really talks about what the purpose is.
As sort of a follow-up, you mentioned a little bit about this, about the audience is nodding off. Cynthia asked, do you have suggestions for recognizing when you are losing your audience during a presentation?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's you want to pay as close attention to how you're interacting with them, what the feedback they're giving you is, the nonverbal, whether it's sort of, are they looking down at their phones? Although these days, honestly, a lot of times you'll be giving a talk and people are looking down at their phones and you think they're disconnected, but maybe they're talking about it, they're tweeting about your presentation. So that always isn't always the best indicator of how engaged someone is. Another thing that is useful to consider is if there's a way to involve them, sometimes in a physical way. So maybe making people stand up. A lot of times, especially if you're doing a talk that, say, maybe people have just come back from lunch, so they're a little sleepy and they're not as sharp or focused, getting them up on their feet and getting their blood flowing can sometimes be a great way to get people a bit more aware and engaged in what you're talking about.
Great. Here's another question. How would you best work with audience members who have the science knowledge, but also hold misconceptions of some, which may block them from actually understanding and accepting your message?
That is probably one of the toughest things. And I will say, there are definitely some people who are resistant to certain aspects of science, who, for whatever reason, have a fear about something. I think this comes up a lot around things, especially related to food or the environment or medicine. These are concerns that people have that are genuine. They may be misguided in some ways because they are not necessarily taking into account all of the facts. You have to at least appreciate that they have a reason for being there. And I think then you want to be able to address it, but also not get bogged down. There is something to be said for, there may be a person in the audience who is going to resist you. And at that point, you want to be careful not to get into a situation where you're speaking just to that person and then ignoring the rest of the audience. You have to be careful to not let them sort of dominate the conversation. That can be very difficult, but it is important when you're dealing with sort of a resistant audience.
Well, great. As a final question, you sort of answered part of it. Patricia asked, do you have some tips for handling a hostile audience as opposed to an audience who might have misconceptions, one is actually openly hostile towards you as a speaker?
Yeah, that's a really difficult situation to be in if it's more than just one or two people in the audience. If you're talking about an entire group, there's a lot of research that shows that if people believe something, that even facts won't really change there, and it often will not just it won't dissuade them. It will actually strengthen their incorrect beliefs. So it's a very challenging aspect. We're actually working on some workshop materials related to this around some controversial topics where there are people who have beliefs that are not supported by science, not supported by the majority of research that's out there or the facts that have been presented. It's a tough situation to find yourself in. I think you have to sometimes acknowledge that there are some people you will not be able to persuade, and you have to figure out if there is a different way to approach them.
Great. So Rachel posed a topic about around knowing your audience. What if you're in a situation where you do not know who will be in the room and aren't really able to find out who will be in the room? What do you do in that case? Any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is if you can talk to any organizer or if you can find out from other people who maybe have been in that situation, what kinds of questions they got on their topics. Again, that's the best way. If you are going into something completely without any information, I would say you want to have at least an idea of the kinds of people who are likely to be there. So say you're doing an event that's like an outreach event at a science museum, or you might be going to like a shopping mall or a plaza in a public park where, you know, there could be lots of different kinds of people. You want to at least think about the type of people who are likely to be there. So say a science museum, you know, you're going to be with families or people who are at least have an interest in science. So you know that they are people who have some curiosity. You don't know their level of training, but you want to be able to maybe kind of have it scalable so that you can get into the basic for someone who has no idea what you're talking about, but they're curious, to there might be a very precocious kid who comes up who really knows a lot about the materials you're going to be talking about, and they might ask you really in-depth questions. It's tough. As anyone who's ever taught or done any kind of workshops, you know, you have to be prepared for being able to switch from it being an advanced topic to, you know, the introduction topic. You have to be able to be adaptable if possible.
Great. Here's a question I think for us who attend the national meetings, especially in the spring for the students. Sheeta asked, are there strategies you recommend to encourage students to develop and improve their science communication skills, such as taking workshops? How would you go about actually encouraging them to do that?
I think it would be great if more students took part in some of the online resources like this that ACS has or other organizations have. I mentioned some of that research from the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. There are some great resources online there. There's also AAAS has a whole center for public engagement. There are lots of resources that are available. How would you encourage students? I think one way of doing that would just be leading by example. So talking about how this helped you. If you are an instructor, it could be something that you make part of the curriculum. I think there are often times where you may think that you know a topic, but until you have to explain it to someone else, that's when you really, it almost reinforces and enhances your knowledge of it in a way that no other experience can. So I think it would be useful for a lot of instructors to think about including some sort of science communication project as part of a curriculum.
Here's a question I think many people who speaking for the audience run into. What do you do about humor? Should you avoid it, use it sparingly, or sprinkle it throughout?
So that's a great question. What I think is the best way to handle humor is to be authentic to yourself. So if you are someone who can be a little humorous, can throw in a joke here and there and go with it, that's great. And I would encourage you to do it, not to the point where you're losing your audience or that it becomes a stand-up show. You want to still talk about something and have people learn. But I think humor can be great. I think the one thing though is that it does vary by audiences, and what you and your lab mates or even you and your family members might think is a great joke might not go over well in all audiences. It's almost an experiment. See if it works, and if it does, you can keep going. But sometimes you might make a joke and it falls flat, and then you realize, oh, this audience doesn't really want that. So I think it's important to, again, read your audience as you're in the process of communicating with them to see what's working. But I also think it goes to that being an authentic person. So, if you're not a funny person, don't necessarily try to fill in with jokes because it's just not necessarily going to come off as authentic.
So Tima asked a question, is it a good idea to tell about your background briefly, as in will it actually help connect with the audience?
I would say in most cases, yes. One of the things that can help an audience connect with information is a story about that information. And it could be a personal story. So like I mentioned, it could be something like, I got inspired to do research in this field because I'm looking to find a cure for a disease that someone in my family had. And, that kind of a personal information can really help your audience feel a story. But it doesn't always have to be about you. It could be a story that you include that's not personal. Again, I think it depends on your comfort level. I think, though, in general, the more that you can humanize yourself, the more that your audience is likely to connect with you.
Nancy has a question I think many presenters might get stumped with. What if an audience member asks a question and you just simply do not know the answer? What do you suggest?
That's a great question. And I think that when you don't know, admitting that you don't know is the best way. You can say, that's a great question. I don't know. I can get back to you with more information. But if they're asking a question, especially something that is maybe off topic or outside of your field, or is just something that you hadn't considered, I think acknowledging that you don't know is important. Again, I think many times people have this fear if they're doing public speaking, or if they are writing something, or if they're communicating online, that they have to show themselves as the expert, and that if they admit not knowing something, that it's a sign of weakness. I think that it makes you more believable in that if you say you don't know something, then I am more likely to believe that the things that you've said that that you really do know them, because you're having a bit of humility and presenting yourself as, again, that authentic person who doesn't know everything but knows a lot. I think it's it's a great way to make sure that you're not overselling yourself.
You've touched on this a little bit before earlier, but Jose asked the question, if you know your audience is 7% advanced and say 30% not advanced, how should you focus your talk? Should you really focus on the 70 and sort of hope the 30 can catch up? Or should you lean more toward the 30 and hope the 70% don't get bored?
That's a really tough question. And my first instinct is there a way that you can do two different sessions? That one that's an intro and one that's the more advanced? And if you can't do that, I think it's important to kind of find a middle ground where you're keeping both audiences engaged, and also, maybe every once in a while throwing in an explainer for the people who don't know, to sort of include them. So you might, again, be talking about something, you don't want to use a lot of jargon, but if you are explaining a concept, you might have to explain it once, and then you can move forward and you can refer back to it, and it can help reinforce that. You don't want to lose if the majority of your audience knows what you're talking about and can follow along, and there's a handful of people, or even a third of the audience that may get a little overwhelmed by the amount of information. You want to be able to balance that. It's tough. You have to kind of keep going, but also maybe drop some carrots for the people who don't have as much in-depth knowledge.
Eve asked an interesting question, and I'm not sure if it's the question for us or a question in general. Her question is, do you prefer to take questions at the end of the talk? So I guess the question is, as a speaker, should you encourage your audience to hold the questions, or should you encourage them to spring the questions throughout as they come up?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the format. Like some settings, it would be more of a challenge to get questions throughout. I do think, though, that if you have a blanket, like no questions until the end, and somebody has a question, there's one person in the audience has a question that maybe a good number of people also in the audience have, that if they just got that 5 minutes into your talk, got the answer, then they wouldn't be stuck. So I think it's important to maybe, even if you go with a no questions till the end policy, to perhaps allow an exception if there's a complete lack of understanding about one aspect. But I think it's a personal It's a personal preference. There are benefits to both. There are pros and cons when it comes to both. It can be an interruption sometimes to get a lot of questions in the middle, and it can maybe disrupt your flow. It might make you feel like, wait, now where was I? I have to start back up. Or even the audience might not connect. You could do a section and then do a check-in with your audience. Like, does everyone understand what I've said? Any questions? But not like the full, like, okay, I want all your questions right now. Just sort of a check-in. It's really a personal preference. I think there are pros and cons to both, though.
We had a question before the webinar even started. It's really more of the person said her interest started on this topic based on a podcast, Clear and Vivid with Alan Alda. I guess to answer the question, we know you're familiar with that center. Is this something you would suggest many other people are interested in this communication? Should they actually invest time in actually researching the Alan Alda Center?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Alan Alda Center has some great resources, and that podcast being one of them. A lot of these examples of good science communication are just examples of people doing science communication, but there are a lot of resources that talk about almost the science of science communication. The National Academies has put out some research that's available online that's from symposia they've had about the science of science communication and about kind of sort of the, not necessarily people doing it, but how they're doing it. And those resources are very helpful, I think. That podcast I have not personally listened to, but I've seen a lot of what folks, both Alan Alda and what folks at the Alan Alda Center have put out, and there's some great resources there. ACS has been one of the sponsors of the Flame Challenge that they put out, which has been like a yearly kind of, how do you explain, it started with how do you explain fire to, I think it was maybe second graders or maybe it was fourth graders, I'm not sure, but basically, and it's that, how do you explain a concept, a scientific concept to a younger audience? So they've done a lot of great work.
Here's another question. How do you recommend actually practicing your presentation? Do you recommend just doing it in front of a mirror, just in your room, in front of family members, friends? Are there any tips for practicing and improving the delivery?
I will say that I like to do both personally. Like, there are times where I will practice something on my own just to see if, does this make sense when I say it out loud? Because sometimes you write something on paper or you even create a slide, but when you are standing up and pretending that you're talking to an audience, you realize, that doesn't flow the way I want it to, or seems a little clunky when I'm trying to talk. So I think practicing by yourself is a good first draft. There is a danger in only relying on that, and that if you don't practice in front of other people, the kind of the blind spots that you have, you won't be able to get some help with that. So the assumptions that you make or the maybe over explanations that you have won't jump out at you the way that they would when someone else sees your communication. Brian had mentioned at the beginning that I had a background in creative writing, and for those of you who don't know, in a lot of MFA programs, what a lot of writing workshops is that you write something and share it with your classmates, and then you sit there for an hour while they just dissect it and talk about what works and what doesn't work, and you really can't react to that. You're just like taking all that information in. But that could be very humbling, because you realize, I thought that this was very clear, but no, the entire point that I was trying to make, the audience has missed. So I didn't do my job. It's key to practice with other people, to have that feedback, and to also not be so proud of your words that you can't take feedback and see that it's going to help you improve. It's important to be proud of the work that you do, but not so proud that you can't change and make it better.
Great. So along the same lines, what is your feeling about actually recording your voice and video while you're practicing?
I think that's a great strategy too, because you will see things that will possibly make you cringe. A lot of people don't like to hear the sound of their voice, or they don't like to see themselves. But a huge part of in-person communication is body language. One of the most challenging things about doing a webinar, for instance, is, I can't really see people in the audience nodding or looking puzzled. So I have to sort of hope that what I'm getting across is out there. But you don't get to see me if I'm making gestures, or there's a lot of communication that is visual, that is not even, it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. So I think that that's a good way to do that, is to record yourself and watch it. And sometimes you're going to cringe, but sometimes you'll see where you're doing something great and that you're making something clear and interesting.
Great. It looks like we have time for one more question. This might be a little tough one here. So Cynthia asks, if you lose control of a presentation to an aggressive audience member or even a co-panelist with you, do you have any suggestions for gracefully bringing the presentation, or at least the part that you're discussing, back on track?
I think that there are times where you might be doing something and you just need to take a breath and pause. And honestly, there can be just a little bit of power that you have in embracing that pause, taking a breath, refocusing, and then just speaking calmly. I think if you are engaging with somebody who is hostile, whether it's their tone, if it's they're making personal attacks, I think what you don't want to do is let them get the better of you. You want to try and keep your cool as much as possible. Really focus on what you're talking about, believing in what you're saying, and not letting someone else get under your skin. That can be really challenging. The cooler heads prevail is a saying that's out there for a reason, because I think the audience will see, okay, this person is being a jerk, and the speaker is being respectful and presenting her information in a way that is not hostile. And I think that's the best way to handle a situation like that.
Chris, thank you for your words of wisdom today. If there's one important lesson you want our listeners to take away from your presentation, what would that be?
It's that fifth tip is practice, practice, practice. The best way to get better at being a science communicator is to try it out, to go out, to always talk about your science, to be engaging with your friends, your family, your neighbors. Strike up a conversation. I think it's important for people to not see science as something that happens in the lab and that doesn't impact their lives, but that has a benefit to them, and that there are people behind the science that are their friends and neighbors as well.
Thank you for watching this presentation. ACS Webinars is provided as a service by the American Chemical Society as your professional source for live weekly discussions and presentations that connect you with subject matter experts and global thought leaders concerning today's relevant professional issues in the chemical sciences, management, and business.